Give me the high sign. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for a special web presentation on higher education and the 2020 election by our guest is Paul Brandus. I'm Mary Todd, Executive Director of the Honor Society of Phi Kappa Phi. And in a normal world, we would be welcoming Paul as a luncheon speaker at our biennial convention this week. When that event was canceled due to the coronavirus, Paul graciously offered to share an abbreviated presentation via Zoom, and we are so very grateful to have him with us this morning. Perhaps better known by his Twitter handle, West Wing Reports, Paul Brandus is an award-winning member of the White House Press Corps, the author of several books on presidential and White House history, including one due to be released on August 25th on Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. He also serves as a columnist for USA Today and MarketWatch Dow Jones. Paul is a frequent speaker at presidential libraries, and we are delighted today to be speaking with him from the Phi Kappa Phi Library here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Welcome, Paul.
Dad, can you hear me okay? You can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, you can now. Okay. Well, good morning and hello, everybody. Thank you very much. You know, we were supposed to be together in Columbus, as Mary said, and here we are instead scattered all around the country. Obviously, a very difficult year, very sobering in many ways. I just wanted to say I hope that everybody is safe. I hope your families are doing well. I had a much more in-depth talk planned for you, as Mary said, but when the conference was was canceled, I called Mary and said, well, maybe I can still do something a little bit shorter. I'd be happy to do that. It's an important topic. So what I've done is I've taken the longer talk that I was going to give and I cut it down. So instead I'll offer a smaller, more streamlined presentation that I hope will be helpful. I think most online presentations go on too long. So this would be sort of a Goldilocks presentation, not too long, not too short, but hopefully just right. Let me outline quickly what we're going to talk about today. We went over this with Mary. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the presidential race, where things stand. I'm at the White House most days, not today, but most days. So we'll talk about sort of where the race stands, a couple of minutes talking about what may happen in November. And then a couple of minutes talking about what both President Trump and former Vice President Biden are proposing to do about higher education. And then if there's any interest, we'll open it up for questions at the end for a couple of minutes. Any topic at all. Mary mentioned I write history books and I'm an economics correspondent and this and that, but questions on anything and everything concerning the White House and presidency, anything you want. So I think we'll go about half an hour if that's okay. And the first thing I wanted to talk about briefly is I do a lot of talks like this, and I always kind of, I've noticed that people tend to misinterpret what happened in 2016, and I'm going to talk about that because it's important and provides, I think, some context for what we're probably going to see this year. So Alyssa, if you could go to the next slide, please. Let's see. Next slide. Next slide. That's right there. Remember this from 4 years ago? Everybody thought that this tweet from a magazine called The Week was taken on election day itself. Hillary Clinton has an 83% chance of winning the presidency. Remember that? I think we all remember that. It looked like she was a pretty sure thing to win. The thing is, it didn't say she had a 100% chance of winning. It said 83%. But it didn't say Trump had a 0% chance of winning. It said he had a 17% chance of winning. Now, these are not the best odds in the world, but they're not the worst either. Next slide, please, Alyssa. Another way of looking at 17%, if you are rolling a dice, say in a game or something, and you need a particular number to show up, well, chances are you're probably not going to get it, but it's a dice. There are 6 probabilities, and you have a 1 in 6 chance, about a 17% chance of your number coming up. So you might say that in 2016, while the odds were heavily against Trump, they weren't impossible. Sometimes that one number that you need comes up. So it's important to kind of add that context. Next slide, please. And people say, oh, the pollsters blew it. Well, did they really? According to the popular vote forecasts in 2016, Clinton would win the popular vote, folks, forecast by, according to various surveys, everywhere from 2 to 4 points. When the final votes were tallied, she won by 2.4 points on the kind of the lower end of that range, but nevertheless, they hit it right within that range. Next slide, please. But as you know, it's the Electoral College that counts, of course, popular vote notwithstanding. So the issue is all of the data, the popular votes, those tens of millions of votes, what really counts is how all that data is distributed among the 50 states. How is all that data spread out? And if you look at this Electoral College map from 4 years ago for Clinton, it does you no good to win by a huge margin in, say, California, which she did, if you lose Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by really narrow margins, which she did. So again, it all depends on how the data is distributed. That obviously is the key point. I think a lot of people learned that lesson 4 years ago. Next slide, please. So the question now, with 3 months to go, is not whether Biden will win the popular vote. By all measures, at least today, he will. Current polling suggests an even bigger popular vote margin than Clinton won in 2016. The current analysis, and again, we're about 3 months out, as you know, shows that Biden has a margin, again, according to aggregate polling, between about 7.4 and 7.9 percentage points. Again, that's about, that's quite larger than what Clinton had 4 years ago. The result we'll find out in a couple of months. Now, without going into too deep into the weeds here, again, I've trimmed this presentation down. I'm going to share what I think is one really important point that is usually overlooked by people when talking about 2016. Next slide, please. And that is the anti-vote. Listen carefully to this. This is a really important point, I think. Exit polls, excuse me, exit polls 4 years ago revealed that about 25% of Trump's voters, that's about 15.5 million people, 25%, weren't so much voting for Trump as they were voting against Clinton. 15.5 million people. Again, this is what they said in exit polls. They were not voting for Trump. They were really voting against Clinton. Again, that is what they said when they left the polls. The anti-vote is a really big deal. The data this year suggests that Biden is seen as being much more likable than Clinton. He's a nice guy. The Trump campaign has been having all kinds of trouble trying to turn Biden into a monster. If you recall 4 years ago, Clinton was crooked Hillary, but Biden is Sleepy Joe. Well, Sleepy Joe is not quite as monstrous as crooked Hillary. And if you talk to people in the Trump campaign, they admit that they're having trouble defining Biden in the negative terms like they did Clinton 4 years ago. It's a problem for them. On the other side of the fence, it's been far easier for the Biden people to define Trump in ways that hurt him. So we're seeing a little bit of a reversal of what we saw in 2016. So to come back to the popular vote, I think there's no question that Biden will win the popular vote. And I think when all votes are counted, and that's not going to happen on election night, by the way, it could take a couple of days, perhaps by even mid-November or so, for maybe even later than that, for all the votes to be counted. I think Biden's popular vote margin will probably be even bigger than Clinton's margin, which was close to 3 million votes 4 years ago. Next slide, please. But again, as I mentioned, the key question is all this data, these tens of millions of votes. The only thing that counts is how all of this data, how all of these votes are going to be distributed among the 50 states. And right now, this is how it looks. Here's a map of kind of the current Electoral College forecast. I'm using here the University of Virginia's Center for Politics crystal ball, they call it. I work with them pretty closely on a variety of things. And they have a very good track record going back a couple of decades. So this is what, the current forecast for the Electoral College looks like. If you look at this carefully, obviously the dark blue states rather are solid Biden states. The dark red states are solid Trump states. And then you've got some variations on those colors in between. If you look at the number of true swing states, those are the yellow states. Some people think there are more than that, but we think there are probably only about 4 true swing states at this point. Arizona, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Florida. If you look at all of the safe Biden states, the likely Biden states, and the states that are leaning towards Biden, that gives him 268 electoral votes. You need 270 to win. So he is not quite there, but he at this point would appear to be about 2 electoral votes away. The president, on the other hand, if you look at all of the safe Trump states, the likely Trump states, and the leaning Trump states, he has, again, at this point, about 204 electoral votes. So that leaves these toss-ups in between. And again, if you accept the premise of these numbers, Biden would need only one of these to win. Trump would need to run the board, win all 4. It's sort of the poker equivalent, I guess, of drawing an inside straight or something. So that's the big picture on where things stand at this point and how all of this data is going to be distributed. Now, anything can happen between now and November, and there's certainly a possibility that the president can win. The Biden folks should not get complacent. There's always a chance that the president can narrow the gap here. 2016 obviously surprised everyone, and he can certainly do it again. But the data suggests that it's going to be a little bit tougher for him this year. Again, that's what it looks like in early August. Next slide, please, Alyssa. So what's going to happen in November itself? And the first thing I think is, and I mentioned this before, is I think we need to forget about this talk of election night. And I think we should talk about perhaps election week, because I think this process could be more drawn out, I think, than most people think. I'm not sure all of the votes are going to be counted on election night itself. And we've seen this in prior elections where it wasn't necessarily decided on election night. It happens more often than you think. Now, why could this happen? Why could it stretch out beyond election night? That's a good question. And there are a series of variables that could stretch out this tabulation of balloting. And these are some of the things I think that could come up. Next slide, please. First of all, there are some physical issues. There are going to be fewer polling stations this year. We saw this in some of the primaries and caucuses earlier in the year for a variety of reasons. There are far fewer polling stations in certain states. That is a bottleneck. We saw some issues of malfunctioning voting machines in places like Georgia. In terms of mail balloting, controversial, according to the president, a controversial issue right now. There perhaps might not be enough ballots printed for what's expected to be an even bigger flood of mail-in voting. And here's something new. You might have heard that the president has been kind of talking down the post office, saying they're not competent and can't really deliver the mail and this kind of thing. The feeling is that the president does not want mail-in voting, although he said yesterday he wants it in Florida because there's a Republican governor there. There's evidence in some states that mail service, mail delivery has, for some mysterious reason, slowed down rather dramatically in recent weeks. In Philadelphia, which happens to be, perhaps not coincidentally, Biden country, mail service has slowed down. There are some critics who warn that this is perhaps a test for slowing down mail service in areas around the country that could impact the counting of mail-in ballots. We'll see, but that is one concern that people have. Next slide, please. Then there are human issues to be concerned about with the election too, just because of this pandemic that we are in. The social distancing is not going away. And I mentioned before the fewer polling stations around the country. When you combine fewer polling stations with social distancing, that creates things like much longer lines, wait lines. How long are people actually going to wait in line to vote? What if it's sleeting in Detroit on election day, for example? That kind of thing. We don't know. The weather is a variable. There's also, because of the pandemic, there's likely to be a shortage of poll workers. This is important because most poll workers tend to be older Americans, volunteers. They've got more time on their hands. There are fears, and again, we saw this during the primary season, there are concerns that some of these older poll workers may be reluctant to show up and work because of health concerns. There are efforts underway to get college students and younger folks to volunteer, that kind of thing. But again, that's kind of an early effort. So if you take all of this together, social distancing, long lines and wait times, the variable of what's the weather going to be like on election day, shortage of poll workers, it could all translate into a much longer time to count all of these ballots. So there are human issues, there are infrastructure issues that could really turn election night into election week. And we saw this, in fact, during the 2018 midterm, just some recent history. Some ballots were still being counted a week later, even 2 weeks later, in key states like Florida, in California. That was only a midterm. Turnout is always much heavier in a presidential year. So I think the possibility of votes being counted weeks later should not be discounted. So again, no talk about election night. I think we have to talk about election week, maybe even election month. Who knows? Next slide, please, Alyssa. Let me get some coffee here. So these are a whole bunch of variables that I've mentioned that could come into play around the country, any of which could affect the distribution of this voting data that I mentioned earlier. All of us could be potentially a perfect storm that could produce a mess in November, frankly, if we're not careful. There are just a whole bunch of things that could go wrong. And just because of the times that we live in, there is also an opportunity for foreigners to stir the pot as well. Next slide, please, Alyssa. Here's the cover of a declassified but heavily redacted Senate Intelligence Committee report. It's too long to go through here, but the highlights are, it says that although the committee, again, this is on the Senate side, which is the Republican-run chamber, the committee saw no hard evidence that Russians were able to change any votes in the 2016 election, but the report does say, and I'm quoting here, that Moscow, quote, may have been probing vulnerabilities in voting systems to exploit later. In other words, 2016 may have been just a dry run for, well, perhaps this year. The Russians have gotten much better than they were 4 years ago. That is a concern that the intelligence community has, and it's not just the Russians. Of course, there are concerns about cyber activity from China, Iran, North Korea, and there's also the vulnerability just of voting systems possibly being the target of bad actors here at home too, just people having fun or just seeing how far they can go and getting into state election systems. And all 50 states are different. There are different ways of voting and different machines around the country. There's no one uniform way, so it makes it hard to defend voting systems when they're so different around the country. So next slide, please. Oops. How those pictures cover up that wording? You can read it though, but let's spend a couple of minutes now talking about one thing that is close to home for all of you, higher education and what the candidates are saying. And we'll look at the former vice president first. Biden, of course, is married to a teacher, Jill Biden. He's been very supportive in the past of free community college. And you might recall that as part of President Obama's America's College Promise proposal, I think that was in 2015 or so, Biden supported 4 years of free college. Nothing is really free, but that's the way it's being proposed. Now, what about costs beyond this, beyond basic 2 or 4 community college or 4-year college? Grad school, for example. Last year, during an exchange with a student on the campaign trail, Biden said that borrowers, people taking out loans for college, he said that borrowers should not have to make payments toward their loans until they're earning at least $30,000 a year. He also said that the interest on those loans should not be allowed to compound until they're earning that much. Again, that $30,000 threshold. Biden also told that student, he said that he would reduce the percentage of income that borrowers repay in, I think, income-driven repayment plans from 10% to 5%. And then last fall, before the campaign got really going, he released a much more formal plan for higher education. Next slide, please. It includes things like doubling the maximum Pell Grant award, automatically enrolling borrowers into these income-driven repayment plans, restructuring loan forgiveness plans, and also allowing borrowers to receive $10,000 in debt relief for every year. This is a new proposal, $10,000 in debt relief for if you do a year of national or community service, which is kind of interesting. So you volunteer in the Peace Corps, work in a hospital or something for a year, you can get some of your college debt reduced. This spring, he updated that proposal on student debt. It now includes plans to forgive all undergraduate federal student debt, emphasize federal student debt from 2- and 4-year public schools for debt holders earning up to $125,000, and there's kind of a phase-out period for those earning more than that. I think part of his updated proposal also included canceling a minimum of 10 grand in debt for student loan borrowers who are coping with this COVID outbreak. A lot of workers obviously have lost their jobs, having trouble making loan repayments and that kind of thing. So that is sort of a new proposal that Vice President has come up with. Next slide, please. Now, what about the president? The president has not been as specific on some of these things as the former vice president, but we do have 3 years of the Trump presidency, though, to look at for clues. So we'll talk about some of those. In the past, the president has proposed cuts to the Department of Education as a whole, specifically to various student financial aid programs. In 2018, for example, his budget would have cut, I think, about $150 billion from federal student programs over a decade. And his most recent budget proposal that was put out earlier this year, back in February, I think, reiterated his support for those kind of cuts, including taking about $2 billion out of the Pell Grant reserve funds. He also proposed eliminating subsidized loans and public loan service forgiveness, those kind of things. But he's also supported a more streamlined loan repayment, kind of cutting some of the bureaucracy that would make it easier to pay back some of these loans. He's also proposed shifting what is called the federal work-study allocation formula. So colleges would receive funds based on the number of Pell Grant recipients that the institution has enrolled. In terms of loan forgiveness, which is seems to be kind of a rather large campaign issue, he has proposed that loan forgiveness, and I think this is important and it's a positive, he has proposed that student loan forgiveness be made available to all borrowers with undergraduate and graduate student loans who participate in one of these income-driven repayment plans. And the specifics would be that borrowers would pay, again, this is according to the president's plan, borrowers would pay about 12.5% of their discretionary income and would receive loan forgiveness after 15 years for their undergrad loans and debt forgiveness after 25 years for their graduate loans. So in that sense, both Biden and Trump are similar with the various debt forgiveness plans. And he also signed an executive order not too long ago, a couple of months ago, that forgives all student loan debt for any permanently disabled U.S. military veteran, which is a nice gesture as well. So that's sort of where both candidates stand on college and student loans and graduate school and that kind of thing. Next slide, please. I think that's probably about it for here. I mentioned to Mary that I know everybody's busy. I would keep this to maybe a half an hour or so, and we're about there. I've kind of gone through this perhaps a little quickly, but I just wanted to give you sort of the big picture, I think, on where things stand, what might happen in November. And if there's any interest, I'd be happy to take any questions about any topic under the sun that you might have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was most interesting. Good context and background for people who will be voting in now just less than 3 months.
Please vote.
Yes, please vote. But we do have some questions, and I'd like to expand on your career a little bit and your work you've done as a presidential historian. So there's a healthy debate right now on Twitter about Vice President Biden's pending announcement of a vice presidential running mate. From your study of, I'm not going to ask for a prediction, I'm just going to ask from your study of American presidents, how significant is the choice of a vice presidential candidate?
Well, the real danger is if you get it wrong. Sometimes presidents make the wrong vice presidential pick and it blows up and it can hurt in November. And I think the vice president is, we thought he might have rolled it out last weekend and he didn't. It's apparently quite a dilemma for him. There's sometimes people think that if you look at the Electoral College, you have to have somebody maybe from an area or state that you need in November, that kind of thing. But he's already said that it's going to be a woman, which certainly narrows the field. And there's additional talk that will be a minority woman, which would suggest maybe California Senator Kamala Harris or Val Demings, the Congresswoman, former police chief from Florida, but we'll see.
So we know from history that it has mattered in a number of cases when there's been a catastrophe with the life of the president, and some people have been elevated to the office as a result of. I'm thinking of President Kennedy. I know you wrote about. And President Johnson, who that's an interesting history. My perspective as an American historian, I won't drag us off into a history discussion, but it has been true in American history that those what they call accidental presidents have really made some significant contributions to the long run.
Well, 8 presidents have died in office, 4 were assassinated, 4 simply died, and then 1, of course, resigned. And if you look at the 8 who took over, Lincoln, obviously, perhaps our greatest president, was succeeded by one of our worst, Andrew Johnson, a drunkard, and he was a racist, I think we can be honest. And he was impeached and came within 1 vote of being convicted in the Senate, so he went from one of our greatest presidents to one of our worst. Lincoln picked him. Franklin Roosevelt, we can be fortunate. He had a couple of vice presidents. We can be fortunate that his final pick was Harry Truman, who turned out to be a terrific president. And then, of course, you mentioned Lyndon Johnson, who was very effective in some ways domestically, but then, of course, he was dragged down and run out of office eventually by Vietnam, so sort of a mixed picture for him. So picking a vice president can be obviously very important. Again, 9 presidents have left office for one reason or another. That's quite a large number. So it's a very critical decision.
And having been a vice president for 8 years, he knows the job. So he knows what he's looking for.
I think so. That's right.
Let me ask you a little bit about your own work. What does a day of a White House correspondent look like? For example, how much of your time is spent at the White House?
Well, these days it's quite different. I'll say that because of the pandemic,
Right.
we're not there as much as we used to be, and the president is now, he's holding these daily briefings again on the virus. He held them back in March and April and then decided that they weren't quite working, and now he's doing it again all by himself. But if you look at when they cut to a shot of the briefing room, it's every other seat that's occupied now for social distancing reasons. So most people can't get in now for that reason. So we might go to other events in the Rose Garden and that kind of thing. So there aren't as many events as there used to be that we can access. That being said, the day-to-day life of covering a president is not that much different. You get the schedule the night before, what he's doing, and we can kind of get advanced schedules of upcoming travel, overseas travel or domestic travel, and plan accordingly if you want to go on one of those trips. And then, of course, you do your job by talking to people around the president, people on Capitol Hill and the various federal agencies, and you try and sort of round out your reporting that way. So in some ways, things have changed, mostly pandemic driven, but a lot of the job is pretty much unchanged. I mean, there's the one kind of the dynamic that a lot of people seem to be talking about is this, you know, the tension between the president and the press, which is pretty significant right now, but that's actually nothing new. It goes all the way back to the beginning of presidency itself, and it waxes and wanes, and it's kind of difficult now. I mean, we're called, you know, enemies of the American people and that kind of thing. So it's a little bit harsh, but we try and filter that out and simply focus on the issues and what he's saying and what he's doing, and we try and do our best.
So we often hear about the pool. How is the pool determined? I mean, how often do you get an opportunity to travel, or is that done by rotating assignment? How does that work?
Well, the pool, for people who don't know, is if you go, I mean, there are a lot of White House credentialed reporters, and if there's an event in the Oval Office or the Rose Garden, you can't fit everybody in there. So on a rotating basis, you take turns. There's a group of people who go in. There's a television pool reporter and a print pool reporter and a excuse me, and a radio pool reporter and that kind of thing. And the agreement is that you go into the event and you share your information with everybody else. That's how everybody gets access to the photos or the audio or whatever. So that's how you do it. And frankly, the TV networks and the newspapers, I like it because it's also cheaper. It holds down costs as well. And that holds true for overseas travel. This president doesn't travel overseas as much as our prior ones. But if reporters want to go on an overseas trip, it's extraordinarily expensive to do. And there are fewer and fewer journalists who go on these overseas trips. Now, there's kind of a misperception about how this works. People think we travel for free or something and the taxpayers pay. No, no, no. We pay out of our own pockets for that. And because of security arrangements, and you have to stay in certain hotels and this and that, it can be literally thousands and thousands of dollars per day to go on one of these trips. So the president goes, say, to India, where he was a couple of months ago, for 2 days, 3 days. That could wind up being $20,000, $25,000, $28,000 per person for just 2 or 3 days. You know, so numbers like that freeze out a lot of people who simply don't go. So we rely more and more on pool reporters to provide that information. But even the folks in the pool who work for the big television networks and the big newspapers, you know, they're being squeezed as well. They have their own cost concerns and such. So it's sort of a downward spiral in terms of access and what you have to pay to get that access. It's quite a problem. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Let me ask you about your book that's about to come out in a couple of weeks on Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. In particular, because it's not a biography, it's a book that focuses on the 5 years between the death of John Kennedy and her marriage to Aristotle Onassis. And I wonder how you decided to focus that story like that and your interest in her.
Well, I try and pick my projects carefully, and you know, she's an interesting figure. I appreciate the chance to talk about it. You know, there are a million books on her and a million books on the Kennedys and so forth, but when it comes to Jackie, I think that most books tend to look at her through the prism of her marriages. Either she was President Kennedy's wife and she was the first lady, and then she was married to one of the world's richest men, Aristotle Onassis. But there's not a lot on the 5-year period in between those marriages. It's November '63 to October 1968. It's a fascinating period when she was on her own, and it's an amazing period of growth and change and struggle. And she moved 3 times in her first year, and she had financial difficulties, and the various men in her life, and just the incredible adventures that she had, you know, with the Marlon Brando and Andy Warhol and the Beatles and just everything. It's just incredible. And there are stories about how, for example, she nearly drowned on a trip to Ireland in 1967. She was nearly swept out to sea one night swimming. She would have vanished. And the story of how that happened and her rescue is just incredible. She married Onassis, but there was a man prior to him who proposed, and she turned him down. And on her own deathbed years later in 1994, she said, "Oh, if only I had married this other person instead of Onassis." She had kind of a deathbed regret about that. So it's a fascinating 5-year period. It was a period of amazing struggle for her, ups and downs, and dealing with you know, the death of her first husband, and trying to move on and regain some semblance of her life. I think I'm obviously biased here. I think it's an amazing story, and also an undertold one. So that's what prompted me to. So it is sort of a biography, but kind of a limited period that I'm looking at.
That's fascinating. I had not seen that sort of approach to a story, because usually people try to do a start to finish approach, and those are kind of the missing years.
There's a 10-part podcast, in fact, that we're rolling out. I think first it's going to be a 10-part series, and I think the first one comes out with a deal with Apple in, I guess, about 2 weeks or so. So keep an eye out, well, ear out, I guess, for that.
All right. Well, it's on my Kindle. I'm waiting for the release date, you know, so we'll look forward to reading that. Let me switch back to higher education for a minute. If you will have to take a couple more questions here. There's been an awful lot of this administration has been known for reversal of policies from the previous administration. And I wonder how difficult that is for the press to cover, at least to ask about in press briefings. For example, the Obama administration sent a letter in 2011 to higher education officials called a Dear Colleague letter, which addressed Title IX and sexual misconduct on college campuses. And in 2017, the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos rescinded the Dear Colleague letter and said that there had been an over-enforcement of college sexual misconduct, which just upset an awful lot of people. And that's where the policy stands right now. Is that a difficult, just as I use that as an example, but a larger question. The policy reversals, are they something it's difficult to question White House officials about?
Well, that's kind of a one big theme of the Trump era, is that sort of in general terms, whatever Obama did was bad and we have to reverse it. And you can look at everything from the Title IX issue that you just mentioned, sexual harassment, to other issues like, NAFTA and Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade deal, to the Iran deal, the Paris climate deal, on and on and on. Some of these big things that the prior administration did, Trump seems to think that they're all, bad and we have to get rid of them. So there have been, as you point out, there had been just a lot of reversals, and it's our job simply to, just on behalf of the American people, we're in the room. Can you explain why you're doing this? What's the impact of this? Is there an economic impact? What's the reason for it? So it's been just a lot of back and forth over that, but there have been a lot of reversals, and there's one that I'll offer kind of a criticism of the White House press, and I'm guilty of this myself, is that one Achilles heel that we have is that there are so many issues and they change so rapidly that one day we're an expert, supposed to be an expert on Iran, and the next day immigration, and the next day higher education, and the next day how much carbon is in the atmosphere, and the next is different things every day. And there's a difficulty, I think, in covering issues when you're sort of a generalist like that. My idea is that some of the best reporting on the administration, in this case, in the case that you mentioned, Mary, is not so much for a White House reporter to question the president and his folks on education, but for a full-time education reporter to question officials on this. There are some journalists who do nothing but cover higher education, know much more about it than I certainly could, or any other generalist could. So that's one way, I think, to have better coverage is to kind of supplement our coverage with more specialized coverage from other reporters. We have the relationships. We know who the officials in the West Wing are and that kind of thing. But then you have the specialized reporters who know the issues much better than we do. So I think that's that kind of it's difficult covering these reversals because are so many of them, and two, they're so complex that it's often helpful to bring in kind of a team reporting based effort to kind of make sense of it. So again, we're simply trying to explain things to readers and viewers as best we can in what is frankly a very difficult environment. So it's not particularly easy.
Well, in a very frenetic news cycle.
Yeah.
The topics changing, not just daily, but several times within a day.
The news cycle has compressed to a very short period of time. I mean, whatever's happening this morning may be very different than what's happening this afternoon. And so I think it's useful to be able to take a step back from time to time and breathe and examine issues and spend time on the phone with people who really know these issues in depth, and also not be, this is kind of another criticism that I have, is that folks should not be as reactive as they are to things. There's no need to instantly react to issues. You can report them, but in terms of offering sort of instant analysis and this kind of thing, I think that's where mistakes can happen. And I think the best reporters tend to take their time, talk to folks, try and round out whatever the issue is with a perspective from a variety of people, and then try and tell the story that way. You make fewer mistakes when you take your time, I think, and I see some of these younger reporters who they feel like they have to say something instantly about an issue, and you don't.
And the news itself becomes an issue, as the Axios interview has in the past couple of days, so that the interviewer himself has been interviewed by endless news outlets. You've been, I should have mentioned in your, I mentioned your Twitter handle in the introduction, but you've been well known for being an early adopter of social media and kind of a pioneer in that. And I understand, I think you're the most highly followed White House correspondent on Twitter.
Well, not anymore. I've been passed by Maggie Haberman of the New York Times and I think Jim Acosta of CNN. They have bigger platforms, but I appreciate whatever the number, 375,000 or whatever it is. I appreciate the fact that people follow me. I'm just very grateful for that. But obviously, if you work for the New York Times or CNN, you have a bigger platform. But good for them. They're good folks.
Let me ask you one last question before we wrap up this morning, Paul. Do you have any idea or sense of where regarding the next COVID relief payment? I know there's discussion going on, but is there anything that you're hearing that's about when we might see something? It's been a long period since the House passed the HEROES Act.
Well, the last one ran out on July 31st, about a week ago now, and starting to hear stories now of evictions, and I've seen data that maybe 1 in 6 American homeowners, evictions for renters, that's one thing, but then 1 in 6 homeowners are going to have trouble making their mortgage payments now. So we could be getting into kind of a foreclosure crisis at some point if they don't do something. And what's surprising to me, Mary, is that usually in an election year, politicians are tripping over themselves trying to shower taxpayers and voters with money. Here's some money for this or that, and yet here we are 3 months away, and they're kind of, dragging their heels here. And just because Washington is such a screwed up, dysfunctional, hyper-partisan place, what we're seeing now is both sides are just taking pot shots at one another as usual. And the Democrats say that the Republicans aren't doing anything, and then you've got the Republicans, even President Trump saying, well, it's all the Democrats' fault, they're just dragging their heels. It's just the back and forth, and this happens with every kind of major issue. And at some point, they'll get into some room and hammer something out. But as of this morning, I don't think I think they're probably inching closer to some sort of a deal, but not yet. But meantime, as I mentioned, it's been about a week, and people are having trouble, writing that monthly check.
And a lot of people staying tuned for some bit of hope out of Washington.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing part of your morning with us today. And we've been it's been delightful to have you with us and to be able to present you to our members who are out in the audience, and to those folks, thank you for being with us too. We hope to be able to do this again.
Well, thank you. It's really my pleasure. I'm just sorry that we couldn't meet. There's nothing better than Columbus in August, as you know. No, that's a dumb joke. But at some point we'll meet. And until then, just let me say thank you. It's been an honor, and appreciate the opportunity today.
Our honor. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.